Hi, Rob. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Allison. How are you?
I'm doing well. So you are a board member here at Reimagine Agriculture. But outside of that, I know that you work with a food company. Can you talk a little bit about your job and what the company does?
Yeah, I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Commercial Bakeries. Commercial Bakeries is a cookie manufacturer for a private label cookie manufacturer, I should add, for many retailers both in Canada and the United States.
I remember when I started this work, I didn't know that your type of company like existed. Like I thought they were like brands and they produced the thing, but like there's this whole other layer of companies who produce things for people to independently buy, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, so we have over about 50 customers and producing, for each customer, between 3 to I would say 12 SKUs, most with different formulations. So, we're a very custom shop that caters to this exact market that you're talking about.
I'm hoping to discuss with you today is the tariffs. I've read a lot in the news about what's going on and how this is affecting people and how it might affect people. Um, but I'm curious to hear like what it's like in your position actually operating under these conditions. So do you remember when discussion first started affecting your work?
Yeah, so I started with the company, shortly after the new year, and you know, at that point, you know, President Trump had made his declaration of, potential tariffs coming to Canada, and Mexico in early February, and you know, the, I think most people expected it just to be, a grandstanding negotiating ploy. As a company, they had started building inventory in anticipation of this. But as soon as I arrived in the weeks that ensued, it really went into overdrive as, the threats became, you know, more and more real. And, our customers, just to give you a bit of context, about 70% of our volume goes to the US. So a lot of our customers started reacting too, and, it became quite a scheduling puzzle to try to fit everyone's last minute demands, in those last couple weeks of January to all the product that they wanted, before
Hmm.
essentially the tariffs hit.
Wow. Yeah. Is it common for Canadian companies to sell so much or have so many customers in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just think based on the size of the markets, the differential at play, broadly speaking, Canada's, 10% of the US market. A lot of Canadian manufacturers with large scale and scope inevitably sell to the US. But for us specifically, I would say that we're probably more the exception than the norm, to have that large of our product mix going to the US.
Mhm. Yeah, I know this came up when I was talking to cultivate meat companies because a lot of them, when they're looking to like to scale, they're actually looking to scale in the U.S. because like it's just there's so many more potential customers there, and so as much as they care about Canadian regulations, like the FDA is actually kind of like they're driving the driving thing that they're trying to scale around and make sure that they can get regulatory approval within.
Yeah, I would say that the US market, as an example, like it's huge. I mean, we have relationships with, I would say, out of the top 10, 3 out of the retailers, and we only have, call it, 10% of market share. So, I mean, we have an opportunity per se to go after, 3 times probably, the volume that we're doing right now in the US. Like it's just massive.
Yeah, and so when like the talk of tariffs started, like to your point, there's a lot of uncertainty and like I think for a long time was like, is anything going to come from this other than a lot of speculation? And so like what did that like what actions were taking or like what did that look like on the ground as you're trying to like figure out what to do now?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that happened. Like one, we started having conversations with all of our key retailers, and we've had longstanding relationships, And, relationships go a long way, but, when you're faced with a 25% cost increase, I mean, they only go they only go so far. So, internally we tried, you know, thinking of different ways to potentially minimize that impact if it came to be. And, you know, when you talk about unproductive time, and that's a reoccurring theme that I hear from a lot of, people similar to me, over the last 3 months. I spent a lot of time developing transfer pricing models and, um, different ways to minimize the tariff impact, that otherwise, I could have been spending time, helping the business grow either from a top line standpoint or a bottom line standpoint. Um, so we did a lot of planning that way. We did a lot of research as to, you know, what how big of a price increase our competitors could could take, without, the price on shelf going up, an extreme amount. So we try to find a good equilibrium so that we could take a case to our customers and, sell it as a mutual beneficial, take. So we did that, and then, we had our workforce on alert. We've had three stops and starts. The one in January, or I should say the
Hmm.
one in early February. We had the one in March, and then we had the one in April. And, we've had to, essentially bring people in for overtime those last couple weeks each of the months, just to, build enough product, for our customers that were demanding it on their end to stockpile, just to get through, this tariff drama. So, it's been, every day's been an adventure, and, not knowing, how the markets are going to turn, and, you know, how to react. So it's been an interesting ride.
It sounds like you have to figure out an entirely new schedule and who's coming in and people working a lot more. But also that you have so much unproductive time that's just spent like preparing for things that might happen, and instead of figuring out like how can we optimize our operations in this environment. It's like I have to prepare for like 14 different environments now.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned our portfolio mix at the start. Like we've got over 50 customers, over 150 different SKUs, and, just to bring something in on a whim in our production schedule, there's trade-offs. So in this case, we had to trade off on certain Canadian retailers to help our US retailers during this time frame, and created tension on on the local soil
Yeah.
here. So it's been interesting. I mean, everyone gets it. So, the Canadian retailers were, I would say, patient for the most part. But, it's been challenging to balance, the different needs.
So at this point, are things becoming clearer what the foreseeable future looks like?
For now, I would say they feel a little bit clearer. I think we're ready to go if, there is a tariff that gets put into place. We've essentially established what we need to establish from an org structure standpoint to help absorb some of that impact. Um, so yeah, it is getting a bit more clearer. Um, the funny thing is, we've had opportunities that have arisen as a result of this. There's a pretty iconic Canadian ice cream, manufacturer maker that wants to go all Canadian now with
Mm-hmm.
their suppliers. So, they reached out to us, and, we're in negotiations with them right now. So, there's been some positive to come out of this, that one being an example. Um, and yeah, no, we're working through it.
One of the things I struggle with is like what is the ideal balance for a food system of like where different products are coming from? Because I think when we look at it from an environmental perspective, um, local food in some cases has an effect on GHG emissions, but often it's quite small. That being said, if we're trying to build a resilient food system, like it's clearly proving right now that having something that's nationally based can be much more resilient when you can have control and you can make policies that are for people who are getting that food. On the other side of that, if Canada were to go through some extreme weather event, like that could put us in a bad position if we aren't used to importing food. Can you, yeah, share a little bit about your thoughts around that?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Um, I've lived through this a little bit with the retaliatory tariffs that came in. There's some of our ingredients that we that we are purchasing and have purchased from the US that got hit with the tariff, and it made us look at, can we source it locally in Canada? And in some cases, for whatever reason, we had never looked down the street to see if, we could get the, flour or, a flavor. And, sure enough, there was a Canadian vendor, and we made the switch. In other cases, for whatever reason, organic wheat being an example, to get it from a Canadian supplier in Saskatchewan is almost a double the price than getting it from the US. So, you know, for companies, I think it's a balance, right? Where, you know, you want to do the right thing and buy Canadian, but if it's presented at such a steep premium versus, options that you can get south of the border, even with a tariff, it's a hard choice. It's a hard one to move to a Canadian vendor at that point.
So, can you talk a little bit about food waste and loss?
Yeah, I think the last 3 months is going to generate and has generated a ton of food waste within the supply chain. Just a general level of uncertainty, you know, has caused, us as manufacturers to overproduce product, has caused our retailers to stockpile product for many more months than they need. And then ultimately, at retail, I think there's a shift that's being had, both, the buy Canadian, um, mantra that's being presented for all the right reasons. Um, and also, I think with the fear of a recession, I think consumer behavior is also going to change. So I think all of this will lead to just product not being consumed or not having the demand to be consumed. And I think this is going to have, a pretty substantial impact, call it 8 to 10 months from now. Once the full impact of the uncertainty that we lived, in these 3 months finally takes hold or fully takes hold.
Hmm. What causes that lag from like now to like 8 to 10 months? We're actually experiencing the cost of that.
Yeah, typically packaged good foods has a shelf life, between, 12 to 14 months. So, you know, a lot of manufacturers, retailers will hold on to product, but, at a certain point, if there's no signal for demand, you um, do have to write off the product and ultimately dispose of it.
I'd be curious. We were talking about food waste. The other thing Reimagine Agriculture talks about a lot about is reducing conventional animal agriculture, and so both finding substitutes for it, or kind of just reducing meat consumption. Do you see do you see any ways that the tariffs will impact that mission, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, it's a good question. I, my sense is that just, farming in general is going to become very cost prohibitive, and you know, I think it's going to be, for some people that were on the fence from a dietary standpoint to make the switch over. I think this may lead more people down that path and make, dietary choices, not only for a financial reason, but also coupled with health benefits that, maybe otherwise they wouldn't have made, if they weren't put in this situation. I do think too that, people may have to become little less choiceful in their meal planning, given, there might be certain limitations in terms of, choices on shelf and, wanting to eat more local. But with that being said, I think that's where this concept of resiliency comes in. People are gonna have to make trade-offs.
Yeah. And I know that I forget where this is, but it's somewhere where they've reduced food waste and loss. Like one of the big differences is when you walk into a grocery store, things aren't perfectly stocked all the time because
Yes.
that's when you're focused on that. That's going to be the trade off. That you can't predict those things and you can't have extra stock on hand just in case. Um, and so yeah, so hopefully we can find the balance of like making sure people don't experience more food insecurity while also saying like, yeah, you're not going to have mangoes available to you every day of the year, and that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Well, thank you so much for having this chat with me. I think I certainly learned a lot, and it's good to hear from someone who's actually experiencing this and like what it looks like for you.
All right. Well, thank you.